January 1942. High above the Pacific Ocean, the sky appeared almost empty, a pale blue expanse broken only by thin streaks of cloud drifting with the upper winds. Far below, sunlight reflected off endless water. There were no front lines here. No trenches. Only distance. A formation of American bombers moved slowly across the sky, heavy and deliberate, their engines vibrating through metal frames built for endurance rather than speed. To experienced fighter pilots, they looked exposed. Almost helpless. Large wings. Predictable course. No agility. Japanese interceptors climbed toward them with confidence. Many of these pilots had already fought over China and Southeast Asia, where lighter enemy aircraft scattered quickly under attack. Against fast fighters, maneuver decided survival. And these bombers did not maneuver. Closing in from behind and above, the attackers prepared for what they believed would be a brief engagement. A swift pass, a burst of cannon fire, and falling wreckage. Then, almost simultaneously, the bombers came alive. Gun ports opened across the aircraft's body. Turrets rotated. And for the next 90 seconds, the sky filled with converging streams of fire. What began as a routine interception was about to challenge everything pilots believed about air combat, a belief shaped long before this war truly began. By the late 1930s, the world's great powers were already preparing for the inevitable air battles of a new, industrialized war. Air power theory had evolved rapidly since the First World War. Britain and the United States emphasized strategic bombing, the idea that carefully targeted aerial attacks could break a nation's capacity to wage war. Germany and Japan, by contrast, invested in tactical aviation, training fighters to dominate the skies over the battlefield and support ground operations. In Japan, the doctrine of aerial supremacy relied on agility, speed, and precision. Fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0 were engineered to excel in dogfights. Japanese pilots trained relentlessly, practicing energy tactics and hit-and-run attacks. Early campaigns in China reinforced the belief that a skilled pilot in a nimble aircraft could outmatch almost any foe. Bombers, slow and lumbering, were considered vulnerable, often described dismissively in internal reports as easy prey for experienced fighter crews. Across the Pacific, the United States took a different approach. American engineers and military strategists placed their faith in bombers designed not only to carry payloads over long distances but to defend themselves in hostile airspace. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, introduced in the late 1930s, embodied this philosophy. Heavy, slow, and meticulously constructed, it was outfitted with multiple .50 caliber machine guns covering every approach, nose, tail, waist, dorsal, and ventral. Crews trained to operate these guns in coordinated volleys, relying on overlapping fields of fire rather than evasive maneuvers. The divergence of doctrine reflected broader strategic thinking. Japan anticipated quick, surgical victories. Air combat was a test of skill and reflexes, not endurance. American planners, by contrast, prepared for a war of attrition. Bombers were not meant to outfly attackers but to outlast them, to endure until their missions were complete, and to make the cost of interception prohibitively high. By December 1941, this philosophical divide collided with harsh reality. Pearl Harbor had drawn the United States fully into the war. The Pacific was suddenly a theater of constant movement. Aircraft carriers, island bases, and sprawling supply lines created a dynamic environment in which air power could determine the fate of fleets and armies. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces began to encounter American bombers in small but consequential numbers. Initial reports from early skirmishes over Wake Island and the Philippines noted something unexpected. While bomber formations were slow and cumbersome, they were far more resilient than anticipated. The human element played an equally critical role. American bomber crews underwent exhaustive training, learning to fire from multiple angles, coordinate with wingmen, and maintain formation discipline even under intense stress. Unlike the highly individualistic approach of Japanese fighter pilots, the Americans emphasized collective action. Formation flying was both defense and strategy. Each aircraft's guns could cover its neighbor, creating a mesh of overlapping fire zones. In theory, this would punish any attacker who misjudged the formation's capability. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence often underestimated the threat. Photographs from pre-war reconnaissance over the continental United States had labeled bombers as slow-moving, almost static machines. These assessments informed training exercises and operational planning. Pilots were briefed on the soft underbelly of American air power, that bombing raids could be disrupted with minimal fighter commitment. Confidence, in this case, was grounded less in observed performance and more in expectation. As winter turned toward spring in 1942, the stage was set for dramatic lessons. American bombers began reaching targets in the Pacific, escorted by few fighters, facing Japanese pilots whose confidence was rooted in prior victories. Each engagement tested doctrine, technology, and human endurance. The clash of philosophies, maneuver versus attrition, agility versus resilience, would shape the first encounters in the Pacific Air War. From this perspective, what Japanese pilots initially saw as an easy target was far more than a slow aircraft. It was a machine designed to absorb punishment, a crew trained to maintain focus under fire, and a tactical philosophy that turned vulnerability into strength. The first encounters would teach hard lessons about underestimating technology, human determination, and the cost of misjudging a new kind of war. By early 1942, the Pacific theater was a sprawling chessboard of islands, fleets, and airfields. Japanese forces had seized momentum after Pearl Harbor, capturing territories across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Air superiority in these regions seemed almost guaranteed. Fighters dominated the skies, and early reconnaissance suggested American bombers were slow, cumbersome, and ill-prepared. But appearances were deceptive. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had begun arriving in the Pacific. Pilots and crews quickly realized that, unlike lighter bombers, the B-17 was a fortress in the sky. Every turret, every machine gun, every overlapping field of fire was meticulously designed to maximize survival. Unlike Japanese fighters trained to pursue agile targets, the B-17 did not dodge, it endured. Its defensive philosophy relied on endurance, collective coordination, and precision fire rather than evasive skill. Initial encounters confirmed Japanese expectations, until the first concentrated defensive volleys erupted. Early skirmishes over the Philippines and over islands like Rabaul revealed something startling: a single B-17, if well-manned and in formation, could repel multiple fighters simultaneously. Pilots noted that even a disciplined squadron of Zeros struggled to exploit their speed advantage against a moving network of interlocking guns. Crew training proved decisive. Each gunner had a designated sector of responsibility, and communication between positions ensured that no angle went undefended. Bombardiers, tail gunners, waist gunners, and dorsal gunners coordinated their fire through rigorous pre-flight drills and constant in-flight practice. Unlike Japanese fighters that depended on individual skill, the B-17's survivability was a product of teamwork. Formation discipline was paramount. Stragglers were at immediate risk, while those in tight defensive formations multiplied the aircraft's lethality. Technological differences compounded the psychological effect. The Zero, light and highly maneuverable, lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Damage that might be superficial to a B-17 could prove catastrophic for a fighter. This imbalance meant that attacking a slow, heavily armed bomber was more dangerous than it appeared. A misjudged approach could result in a plane lost for every bomber engaged. These lessons were amplified during missions over islands like Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Japanese pilots, confident in their tactical superiority, were sometimes caught by surprise. They were trained to expect fleeing or panicked bombers, not a coordinated machine of interlocking defense. Reports from American gunners described the sky erupting in streams of tracer rounds, converging with uncanny precision. Pilots who initially mocked the slow, lumbering bombers were forced to adapt, realizing that skill alone could not overcome collective resilience and firepower. Meanwhile, American doctrine evolved in parallel. Observers and commanders recognized that the bomber's value extended beyond the immediate mission. Each aircraft that survived a fighter engagement strengthened the broader war effort. The B-17 was not just a vehicle for bombs, it was a weapon of deterrence. Its presence in the air forced Japanese pilots to expend energy, munitions, and risk lives, even before bombs reached their targets. The cost-benefit calculus of interception shifted dramatically. By mid-1942, these encounters had begun reshaping both sides' strategies. Japanese pilots had to adjust tactics, increasing coordination and approaching with more caution. American crews gained confidence, understanding that their aircraft's defensive systems could blunt even the most audacious attacks. What had started as a philosophical divergence, agility versus endurance, was now a tangible, measurable factor in the Pacific Air War. These early battles, though small in scale, set the stage for dramatic confrontations in the months to follow. A slow bomber was no longer an easy target. The lessons of 1942 would echo throughout the war. Underestimating the resilience of technology, or the coordination of human crews, could prove fatal. And the next time Japanese pilots approached a B-17 formation, they would find themselves confronting a new reality, a fortress in the sky that refused to break, no matter how swift the attack. The stage was now set for examining the multiple perspectives that defined this clash, from human courage and fear, to technological ingenuity, and the tactical doctrines that framed these encounters. Inside the B-17, the atmosphere was tense yet oddly ritualistic. Crews were confined within narrow fuselages, moving between stations along steel catwalks. The bombardier crouched at the nose, eyes fixed on the target, scanning constantly for approaching fighters. Waist gunners and tail gunners shifted nervously, hands gripping triggers, ears ringing with engine vibration and machine gun reports. Every sound, every shadow, was magnified. Fear was a constant companion. Pilots knew the formation could absorb damage, but each burst of tracer fire reminded them of mortality. Yet within that fear was purpose. The discipline of coordination turned anxiety into focus. Crews relied on pre-flight drills, verbal signals, and rehearsed maneuvers. A single misstep could be fatal, a perfectly timed response could save lives. Every gunner had a sector to cover, every man an unspoken responsibility to his neighbor. In that way, courage was inseparable from teamwork. The human element transformed a machine into a collective force, a living network of resilience. From above, Japanese pilots initially saw the B-17s as slow-moving targets, ripe for easy victories. Veterans of China and Southeast Asia assumed agility and marksmanship were enough to secure kills. Briefing reports described lumbering bombers that could be approached and destroyed in moments. Confidence was high. But in combat, reality diverged sharply from expectation. Zero pilots found that their speed and maneuverability could be neutralized by overlapping fields of defensive fire. Approaches that would have worked against smaller aircraft now resulted in damaged wings, riddled fuselages, or entire planes lost. Observers recorded a palpable shift in Japanese behavior. Attacks became more cautious, angles more calculated, and coordination more deliberate. The pride of individual skill had collided with a machine designed for endurance, a humbling lesson in industrialized war. The B-17 was a marvel of 1940s engineering. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, strategically placed, allowed near-complete defensive coverage. Tail, nose, dorsal, ventral, and waist positions created interlocking zones of fire. Add to that armor plating around critical components and self-sealing fuel tanks, and the bomber could sustain damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Yet technology alone was insufficient. The defensive guns were only effective when crews operated in harmony. Each gunner's line of fire had to complement the others, covering blind spots and anticipating attack vectors. Against a swarm of agile fighters, the bomber became not a single target, but a lethal network, punishing mistakes and rewarding disciplined formation. In this way, engineering and human coordination were inseparable, one amplifying the other. The American bomber's strength did not lie in speed or maneuverability, it lay in disciplined formation. Flying in close proximity, B-17s created overlapping zones of fire that transformed multiple lumbering planes into a single, coordinated weapon. Each aircraft's guns protected not only its own fuselage but also the blind spots of its neighbors. This tactic required absolute precision. Pilots had to maintain steady altitude, speed, and heading, even under enemy fire. One plane drifting from formation could open gaps, exposing the group to concentrated attacks. Yet, when executed correctly, this method multiplied defensive capability. Japanese fighters discovered, often to their shock, that a single bomber's guns were dangerous, but a formation's combined fire could overwhelm even the most skilled pilot. The bomber became a moving fortress, lethal, patient, and relentless. The contrast in strategic thinking between American and Japanese forces was stark. Japanese doctrine emphasized agility, individual initiative, and rapid strikes. American doctrine favored endurance, redundancy, and collective defense. Leaders in the United States recognized that industrialized warfare demanded machines capable of absorbing punishment, and crews trained to exploit that resilience. Commanders understood that the bomber's purpose extended beyond the immediate mission. Each aircraft that returned intact preserved experience, morale, and industrial investment. Leadership focused not on glory in the air, but on sustained effectiveness. In the Pacific, this meant reinforcing bomber groups with strict discipline, careful mission planning, and tactical evolution, lessons that Japanese pilots would learn only after costly encounters. The encounters challenged traditional notions of heroism in air combat. Where dogfights between nimble fighters had once celebrated individual skill and daring, the bomber's endurance emphasized patience, coordination, and mechanical resilience. Courage was no longer measured by acrobatics in the sky, but by the ability to operate within a machine, to trust in training, technology, and comrades under fire. Japanese pilots confronted a psychological paradox. Their skill, honed over years, was insufficient against disciplined formations of lumbering planes. The expectation of quick, decisive kills was replaced by danger, uncertainty, and frustration. Fear and respect intertwined. Even the most confident pilots realized that attacking a B-17 demanded not just agility but calculation, timing, and often, willingness to risk life in ways previously unimaginable. April 1942. The morning sun stretched across the Pacific, illuminating a formation of B-17 flying fortresses as they lumbered steadily toward a distant Japanese-held airfield. From thousands of feet above, the ocean below was a mirror, reflecting every cloud and every glint of sunlight. The bombers were fully loaded, their engines humming a low, steady rhythm. Inside, crews moved through their stations with disciplined calm, aware that enemy fighters could appear at any moment. Above them, Japanese Zeros detected the formation. Pilots, confident from previous engagements, banked sharply to close the distance. Their strategy was simple: a coordinated dive from above, exploiting speed and surprise, expecting the bombers to falter under pressure. In earlier theaters, this tactic had almost always succeeded. The first passes began. A trio of Zeros surged forward, tracers streaking toward the nearest bomber. But the B-17s were prepared. Tail gunners rotated, cutting lines of fire across the sky. Waist gunners adjusted, firing in concert with their counterparts. Dorsal turrets tracked the attackers as they attempted to maneuver into blind spots. Streams of tracer rounds intersected in midair, a lattice of lethal precision. Chaos erupted, but not among the Americans. Each gunner adhered to protocol, each crew member maintaining focus despite the roar of engines, the whistle of incoming fire, and the sudden explosions around them. Smoke rose from a nearby bomber, its tail damaged, yet the formation did not falter. It remained steady, a moving wall of coordinated defense. Japanese pilots were forced to adapt on the fly. The first pass inflicted no decisive damage. The second pass was met with more concentrated fire. 1-0 spun out of control, trailing smoke, another veered sharply to avoid converging streams of bullets. Confidence faltered. The initial assumption, that the bomber was slow, vulnerable, and an easy target, collapsed within moments. From the cockpit, the bomber pilots observed the attackers' confusion. Each maneuver by the Zeros was anticipated, each angle of attack countered. The 90-second engagement, which seemed like a brief encounter from afar, felt eternal inside the bombers. The interlocking defenses created a rhythm, a deadly choreography. Bullets met aircraft, wings sparking with impacts, but the fortresses pressed onward, their guns never ceasing. Ground observers on nearby islands would later report seeing the sky split with tracers, smoke, and flashes of gunfire. Yet remarkably few bombers fell. The lesson became immediately evident: the B-17's strength was not in evasion but in resilience, in disciplined, collective resistance. Even as the fighters regrouped, attempting new approaches, the formation adjusted seamlessly. Bombardiers continued to track targets, tail gunners rotated to new positions, and pilots maintained level flight, ensuring the overlapping fields of fire remained unbroken. The Japanese pilots had entered the engagement expecting a swift victory. They were now trapped in a crucible where every miscalculation was punished. This first sustained encounter demonstrated the deadly paradox of the B-17, slow, lumbering, and seemingly vulnerable, yet nearly impossible to destroy when crews and formation operated in harmony. Within minutes, the Japanese realized that attacking a fortress was no longer a test of skill alone, it had become a battle against preparation, coordination, and sheer endurance. By the time the engagement ended, several fighters had withdrawn, some heavily damaged, others completely destroyed. The bomber formation, though scarred with pockmarks of bullets and minor fires, pressed on toward its target. A psychological victory accompanied the physical one. Confidence in the B-17's doctrine had been proven under fire, and Japanese pilots were left to reassess their assumptions about the war in the Pacific. The second phase of the engagement was even more intense. Japanese commanders ordered coordinated attacks from multiple directions, hoping to overwhelm the bomber formation with sheer numbers. Zeros came diving from above, spinning from the sun to mask their approach, while others attacked head-on, attempting to exploit what they believed were weak points in the fortress's defenses. Inside the B-17s, the crew's training was tested to the extreme. Gun turrets rotated in perfect unison, gunners calling out targets, adjusting for lead, compensating for the aircraft's movement. The bombardier's scope tracked incoming fighters, relaying critical information to waist and dorsal gunners. Each gunner's fire interlocked with another's, creating a web of steel that converged precisely where the attackers aimed to strike. For 90 seconds, the sky became a crucible of sound, motion, and fury. The roar of engines blended with the staccato of machine guns and the whistle of tracer rounds. Japanese pilots, expecting an easy kill, were met with disciplined, sustained resistance that punished miscalculations. Wings were shredded, fuselages punctured, and smoke trailed from engines. Yet the bombers pressed forward, each moment reinforcing the lesson that speed alone could not guarantee survival. The psychological toll on the attackers was immediate. Pilots accustomed to dominating engagements felt vulnerable for the first time. Confidence gave way to hesitation. Some attempted evasive maneuvers mid-dive, only to be met by guns that adjusted with uncanny accuracy. A veteran pilot later wrote in his combat diary, "We thought we hunted ghosts. Instead, we were the prey." Meanwhile, the fortresses demonstrated the lethal advantage of endurance and coordination. Even damaged aircraft continued to maintain formation integrity. Pilots understood that breaking formation could be fatal, not just for themselves but for the planes around them. Each aircraft became a node in a defensive network, each crew member a critical component in a machine whose purpose was survival. By the end of the engagement, the results were clear. Several Japanese fighters were destroyed, more were forced to retreat with heavy damage, and not a single B-17 had been lost. The combination of crew discipline, interlocking gunfire, and unyielding aircraft design had overturned expectations. What was meant to be a quick, confident strike had become a costly lesson in underestimating the enemy. This moment marked a turning point in Pacific aerial warfare. Japanese pilots, who had prided themselves on agility and precision, were forced to re-evaluate tactics. Intercepting bombers required more than daring, it demanded careful planning, coordination, and acceptance of the inherent risks involved in facing machines designed to endure. For the American crews, the battle validated the philosophy that had guided bomber development. The Flying Fortress was more than a plane. It was a weapon of attrition, a floating fortress that leveraged collective human effort and technological design to survive and impose consequences on its attackers. Confidence soared alongside the aircraft, setting the tone for future missions and shaping the strategic approach to long-range bombing campaigns in the Pacific. As the formation continued toward its target, battered but unbroken, the early assumptions of war were shattered. The slow, lumbering bomber had proven that endurance, preparation, and coordination could rival agility and skill, forcing both sides to adapt. The encounter became a defining moment, where human resilience, technology, and doctrine collided in a concentrated, violent proof of principle. From here, the consequences of this engagement rippled outward, influencing tactics, leadership decisions, and the psychological state of pilots on both sides. The next stage of the story would reveal the full aftermath, the losses, the lessons, and the strategic recalibrations that reshaped the air war over the Pacific. The immediate aftermath of the April 1942 engagement left both sides reeling. Reports from Japanese pilots were filled with astonishment and frustration. What had been intended as a routine interception became a costly lesson in underestimating both machine and crew. Several Zeros had been shot down, others returned with wing damage, punctured fuel tanks, or riddled fuselages. Pilots who had approached with confidence were now haunted by the realization that speed and maneuverability alone could not guarantee survival. For the American crews, the sense of accomplishment was tempered by the grim realities of war. The B-17s had survived, but not without damage. Tracer rounds had ripped through fuselages, punctured control surfaces, and set fires in cargo bays. The tail gunner's position, often exposed to the heaviest fire, bore the marks of concentrated attacks. Yet, despite these injuries, the formation remained intact, and every plane pressed onward to its bombing target. This resilience demonstrated that doctrine, discipline, and collective coordination could outweigh the apparent vulnerabilities of a slow-moving aircraft. The engagement also triggered immediate tactical reassessments. Japanese commanders recognized that their previous approach, relying on individual skill and surprise, was insufficient against disciplined bomber formations. Future missions demanded larger numbers of fighters, coordinated attack angles, and constant vigilance against overlapping defensive fire. Interceptions could no longer be a simple test of pilot agility, they had become calculated operations with higher stakes and greater risk. For the Americans, after-action debriefings highlighted the effectiveness of interlocking gun zones, formation discipline, and crew training. Lessons were codified, reinforcing the importance of tight formations and communication under fire. Crews were commended for maintaining composure, executing coordinated fire, and preserving the integrity of the formation despite intense pressure. These encounters proved that the B-17's design philosophy, endurance and collective defense, was not theoretical but practical, capable of turning near-certain danger into survival. On a broader level, the engagement influenced the strategic calculus of both sides. Japanese air forces were forced to weigh the cost of attacking bombers more carefully. Losses of trained pilots could no longer be justified by the anticipated destruction of a single aircraft. The Americans, meanwhile, understood that the bomber's value extended beyond individual missions. Each surviving crew represented not just immediate firepower but also the preservation of experience, morale, and long-term capability. Psychologically, the battle reshaped expectations. For Japanese pilots, confidence in the inevitability of swift aerial victories was shaken. Veteran reports reflect a newfound respect, tinged with caution, for the resilience of American bombers. American crews, in contrast, emerged emboldened. They had endured a test of nerves, skill, and endurance. And had survived. The lesson was unmistakable: in the Pacific, industrialized air power was beginning to define the rules of engagement, superseding the old paradigm of individual heroism. This confrontation also laid the groundwork for future air campaigns. Strategic planners recognized that bomber formations could act as both offensive and deterrent forces. Each engagement imposed a cost on the enemy, even if the immediate mission objectives were modest. In this sense, the survival of the B-17s was itself a weapon, forcing Japanese pilots to expend resources, take risks, and adjust doctrine. The stage was now set for broader implications. The early lessons learned in these encounters would influence escort strategies, the development of coordinated fighter-bomber tactics, and the psychological conditioning of air crews on both sides. The Pacific Air War was evolving, and these formative battles were teaching that survival, not just destruction, would define mastery in the sky. As the months passed, the consequences of these early B-17 engagements rippled across the Pacific theater. American commanders increasingly relied on formation discipline and bomber resilience to shape offensive and defensive strategy. The concept of defensive attrition became central. A single bomber formation, properly executed, could not only deliver its payload but also inflict measurable losses on attacking fighters. Each mission was now a dual exercise in offense and defense, teaching Japanese pilots that attacking these flying fortresses carried escalating risk. The Japanese air strategy evolved, albeit slowly. Commanders emphasized coordinated strikes by multiple aircraft from different angles, sometimes launching sequential waves to overwhelm defensive fields of fire. Experienced pilots were briefed to avoid isolated engagements and to conserve energy for precise maneuvers. Despite these adjustments, the initial psychological shock endured. Veterans of early encounters recalled the terror of converging tracer fire and the sudden collapse of their expectation that speed guaranteed victory. Confidence was replaced with caution, and even skilled pilots began to respect the industrial might behind American aircraft. Meanwhile, American doctrine continued to adapt. Bombers increasingly flew escorted missions, pairing formations with long-range fighters such as the P-38 Lightning and later the P-51 Mustang, enhancing survivability and extending operational reach. Tactical planning incorporated lessons from each encounter. Which altitudes minimized vulnerability, how to stagger formations to cover blind spots, and the optimal coordination between gunners to sustain defensive fire. The B-17, once viewed by some as a slow lumbering target, had become the centerpiece of a new form of aerial warfare, one where machine, crew, and doctrine intersected to create formidable resistance. Industrial and strategic implications were equally profound. Each B-17 that returned intact preserved human capital. Trained gunners, pilots, navigators, as well as costly equipment. Losses of Japanese aircraft and experienced pilots in repeated encounters forced a reconsideration of offensive priorities. Attrition, not just bombing effectiveness, became a measure of success. American planners understood that surviving the engagement often mattered as much as reaching the target. In the long term, repeated survival shaped the balance of air power across the Pacific. The psychological impact on both sides cannot be understated. For Japanese pilots, the myth of effortless aerial dominance was eroded. Reports from after-action debriefs emphasize a newfound caution and respect for the bomber formations they had once dismissed. American crews, conversely, gained confidence in their training, their aircraft, and the doctrine guiding their operations. The B-17 was no longer merely a plane. It was a symbol of endurance, discipline, and technological innovation, capable of rewriting expectations about what was possible in air combat. Strategically, these early engagements influenced the larger conduct of the Pacific War. Japanese forces learned to avoid direct confrontation with unescorted heavy bombers whenever possible. Americans, understanding the bomber's dual function as weapon and deterrent, began to plan larger-scale raids designed not just to destroy targets but to attrit enemy air forces. The encounter had shifted the psychological and operational calculus of air combat. The slow, heavily armed bomber had proven that coordinated human effort, technological ingenuity, and doctrinal discipline could triumph over agility and perceived skill. By mid-1942, the lessons of these encounters had crystallized. Japanese and American pilots alike carried a deeper understanding of the evolving dynamics of war in the Pacific. The B-17s had established that air supremacy was no longer purely a measure of speed and maneuver. It was now a question of endurance, coordination, and the willingness to exploit the synergy between human crew and machine. What had begun as a surprise engagement in the early months of the war had become a foundational case study, shaping strategy, doctrine, and the very psychology of combatants for the months and years to follow. The encounter between American B-17 crews and Japanese fighter pilots stands as a turning point in the history of aerial warfare. It revealed a fundamental truth: speed and agility, once considered the ultimate measure of skill in the skies, could be countered by preparation, coordination, and resilience. The lumbering bomber, underestimated and mocked, demonstrated that endurance, collective action, and technological design could rewrite the rules of engagement. Inside the steel fuselage of the Flying Fortress, human courage intertwined with machinery. Crews learned that survival depended not on individual heroics but on trust, in training, in doctrine, and in each other. Each defensive turret became a node in a network of protection, each disciplined crew member a vital component of a living system. This integration of human and machine transformed fear into purpose, turning a slow-moving bomber into a fortress capable of repelling even the most confident attacker. For Japanese pilots, the psychological impact was profound. The myth of effortless aerial dominance shattered in a matter of moments, replaced by caution, respect, and a recognition that industrialized warfare demanded adaptation. Tactics had to evolve, strategy had to account for attrition, and even the most skilled pilot had to acknowledge that victory was never guaranteed. On a broader scale, these early encounters foreshadowed the evolution of the air war across the Pacific. They highlighted the shift from duels of individual skill to conflicts defined by endurance, coordination, and technological sophistication. The lessons of the B-17s informed the development of bomber escorts, improved crew training, and the strategic planning of campaigns that would eventually turn the tide of the war. Ultimately, the story of the Flying Fortress is a story of human ingenuity meeting industrial innovation. It reminds us that warfare is not only a test of speed or bravery but of preparation, adaptation, and the ability to endure under fire. In the skies over the Pacific, where the Japanese pilots once mocked a slow bomber, the 90 seconds of sustained defensive fire became a symbol of resilience, of strategy, and of the transformative power of doctrine combined with human determination.